July 18th, 1944. Normandy, France. Sergeant Michael Kovacs watched his third tank burn that week. Inside were 4 men he'd eaten breakfast with that morning. The German gunner who killed them was over 100 yards away, a distance that should have made accurate fire nearly impossible. But it wasn't impossible, because the Germans had something the Americans didn't know about. Something that turned every Sherman tank into a perfect target, visible through smoke, through fog, even through the chaos of battle. 3 weeks later, that same sergeant would roll through the same hedgerows in a Sherman that looked like it had been attacked by a drunken farmer. Branches stuck out at impossible angles. Mud covered the hull in asymmetric patterns. A broken wagon wheel hung off the turret. It looked ridiculous. The German gunners fired 17 times at his position that day. Every single shot missed. Not by inches, by yards. It was as if the tank had become invisible. This is the story of how American tankers accidentally discovered a flaw in German military technology using nothing but mud, branches, and $5 worth of junk. And how that discovery would save thousands of lives before the war's end. To understand what happened, we need to go back to June 1944, right after D-Day. The American Third Army was pushing through Normandy, and their Sherman tanks were dying at an alarming rate. The statistics were brutal. In some engagements, American tank battalions lost 60% of their vehicles in a single day. Crews called the Sherman the Ronson after the cigarette lighter because it lights up the first time, every time. Tank crews had one of the highest casualty rates in the entire U.S. Army. Everyone knew the Sherman had problems. Its armor was thinner than German Panthers and Tigers. Its 75mm gun couldn't penetrate German heavy tanks from the front. But these weren't the real problems killing American tankers in Normandy. The real killer was something most soldiers had never heard of: the German coincidence rangefinder. Here's what made it so deadly. When a German anti-tank crew spotted a Sherman, they didn't guess the distance. They used a precision optical instrument called a rangefinder that could calculate exact distances up to 2,000 yards in seconds. With that information, German gunners could land their first shot with devastating accuracy. First shot kills. That's what was slaughtering American tank crews. The Germans would fire once, hit precisely, and the Sherman would brew up before the crew even knew where the shot came from. American tankers tried everything. They welded extra armor plates onto their hulls, called expedient armor. They hung sandbags on the front. They moved in groups, hoping safety in numbers would help. Nothing worked. The German rangefinders were too good. Then came an incident that nobody thought much about at the time. Private First Class Eddie Kowalski was a 19-year-old loader in a Sherman commanded by Lieutenant James Parker. Their tank, nicknamed Bitch Magnet by the crew because it seemed to attract every German shell in France, had been hit twice in 2 weeks. Both times, the crew survived by abandoning the tank seconds before it exploded. On July 22nd, Parker's tank threw a track in a muddy field outside St. Lo. They were stuck for 6 hours while the recovery team worked to fix it. During that time, the tank sank partially into the mud, and local vegetation grew up around it. When they finally got moving again, nobody bothered to clean off the mud or cut away the plants. They were exhausted, and besides, they'd just get dirty again in 10 minutes. That afternoon, Parker's Sherman was involved in a skirmish with German positions. An 88mm anti-tank gun opened fire from about 800 yards, well within its effective range. The first shot missed by 15 feet. The second shot missed by 20. The third shot didn't come at all. The German gun crew repositioned, clearly frustrated. Parker and his crew thought they'd gotten lucky, but something stuck in Lieutenant Parker's mind. Those weren't neared misses. Those were misses. Big misses. From a weapon system known for its precision. Parker wasn't an engineer. He'd been a high school math teacher before the war, but he understood angles and measurements, and something about those misses bothered him. That evening, back at the company position, he mentioned it to another tank commander, Lieutenant Robert Chen. Chen had been an architecture student at Berkeley. Together, they started talking through what might have happened. Chen brought up something he'd learned in an architecture class about how optical instruments work. Rangefinders, like the ones surveyors use, depend on measuring a target against a known baseline. They work by viewing the same target from two slightly different positions and measuring the angle difference. But here's the crucial detail. Rangefinders assume they're measuring a solid, defined object. A nice, clean rectangular tank, for example. They need clear edges, defined shapes, recognizable patterns. Parker's tank hadn't looked like a tank anymore. It had looked like a mud pile with plants growing out of it. Random shapes, no clear edges, no recognizable silhouette. What if, Chen suggested, the German rangefinders couldn't get a proper reading? What if all that mud and vegetation had broken up the tank's outline enough that the optical instruments couldn't lock onto it properly? It was just a theory. But theories were cheap, and Sherman tanks were expensive, not to mention the lives inside them. Parker made a decision. They were going to test it. The next morning, Parker convinced his company commander, Captain Marcus Webb, to let him try something. Webb was skeptical, but desperate. They'd lost 11 tanks in the past month. He gave Parker permission to modify his tank however he wanted. What happened next looked like chaos. Parker and his crew didn't just smear mud on their tank, they studied it. Chen sketched out the Sherman's profile from different angles, identifying the clean lines and right angles that would show up clearly in a rangefinder. Then, they deliberately destroyed those lines. They packed mud onto the hull, but not evenly. They created irregular lumps and protrusions that broke up the straight edges. They attached branches at odd angles, not lying flat like normal camouflage, but sticking out perpendicular to the hull. They found a broken cartwheel from a destroyed French farm and bolted it to the turret at a 45-degree angle. Other crews gathered to watch, laughing. One sergeant called it the ugliest tank in France. Parker's own crew thought he'd lost his mind, but Parker understood something the others didn't yet. He wasn't trying to make the tank invisible to the human eye. He was trying to make it invisible to mathematics. A rangefinder works by measuring angles to specific points on a target. It needs to identify, this is the front of the tank, and this is the back of the tank, to calculate distance. But if you can't tell where the tank starts and ends, if every point on the surface is at a slightly different angle, if the silhouette is chaotic rather than geometric, the rangefinder gets confused. It was like trying to measure the distance to a cloud. The cloud is visible, but where exactly do you measure to? On July 24th, Parker took his modified tank into combat. The engagement happened near the village of Marigny. German forces had established a defensive line with at least 2 Pa-40 anti-tank guns and 1 80-mm gun in prepared positions. Parker's platoon advanced in a standard formation. The other 4 tanks in his unit were clean, standard Shermans. His looked like a moving junk pile. The German guns opened fire at approximately 900 yards. The first German shell hit Lieutenant Morrison's tank, one of the clean Shermans, squarely in the front glacis plate. Morrison's crew bailed out as the tank began to burn. The second shot hit another clean Sherman, killing the driver instantly. Then the German gunners turned their attention to Parker's tank, which was now the closest target. They fired 6 times in 3 minutes. Every shot missed. Not by a little, by a lot. One shell landed 40 feet to the left. Another sailed over the tank completely. The German gunners were clearly firing, clearly aiming, but their shots were landing as if they were guessing distances rather than measuring them. Parker's gunner, meanwhile, had no such problems. With the Germans focused on figuring out why they couldn't hit this strange-looking tank, Parker's crew knocked out 2 of the 3 enemy guns. When Parker returned to base that evening, Captain Webb was waiting. He'd been monitoring the radio traffic and heard the engagement. He'd heard Parker's crew calmly reporting that they were taking fire, but not being hit. Webb walked around Parker's tank slowly, studying the modifications. Then he said 5 words that would change American armored tactics for the rest of the war. Show every crew how to do this. What happened next wasn't an official order from headquarters. It was something more organic and more powerful. Word of mouth between soldiers who desperately wanted to survive. Parker and Chen spent the next 3 days teaching other crews their technique, but they weren't just showing them how to slap mud on a tank. They were teaching the principle behind it. Think like a German rangefinder, Chen would tell the crews. You need to break up every straight line, every right angle, every recognizable shape. The tank needs to look like chaos. Different crews developed different approaches. Some focused on vertical protrusions, poles, branches, even broken rifles stuck into the mud at odd angles. Others created horizontal asymmetry, making one side of the tank look completely different from the other. One innovative crew commander, Sergeant William Wild Bill Harrison, took it further. He realized that German rangefinders needed 2 clear points to measure between, so he made sure that any 2 points on his tank were at wildly different heights and angles. He built up mud structures on his turret that made it impossible to tell where the turret ended and the hull began. Another crew discovered that hanging objects that moved, like chains or fabric, created even more confusion. The movement made it harder for the rangefinder operator to hold a steady measurement. Within 2 weeks, modified tanks were appearing throughout the Third Army. Battalion commanders who saw the survival rates began quietly encouraging their crews to adopt the modifications. Some officers even assigned soldiers to gather materials, branches, mud, abandoned farm equipment, specifically for tank modification. The technique spread to other units through informal channels. Tankers from different companies would meet at supply depots or rest areas and share what worked. A sergeant from one battalion would sketch out his tank's configuration for a lieutenant from another unit. By mid-August 1944, an estimated 40% of American Sherman tanks in Normandy had some form of these modifications, and the survival statistics were beginning to change. The Germans noticed something was wrong, but they couldn't figure out what. After-action reports from German anti-tank units began mentioning unusual difficulties engaging American armor. Gunners reported that their rangefinders were giving inconsistent readings. Some reports blamed equipment malfunction. Others suggested that American tanks were using some kind of electronic jamming device. A German technical intelligence unit actually captured one of the modified Shermans intact in early September. Engineers examined it thoroughly, photographed it, and wrote a report. The report concluded that the modifications were primitive camouflage and dismissed them as ineffective. The German analysts completely missed the point. They were looking at the modifications from a human visual perspective, not from the perspective of their own range-finding equipment. This reveals something fascinating about military technology. Sometimes the people using advanced equipment don't fully understand its limitations. The German rangefinders were precision instruments, and the Germans trusted them completely. It never occurred to them that such sophisticated technology could be defeated by mud and sticks. Some German officers did recommend removing rangefinders and relying on experienced gunners, making distance estimates by eye. But this suggestion was rejected. The rangefinders were too valuable, too accurate under normal conditions. Abandoning them would mean abandoning a significant technological advantage. So the Germans kept using their rangefinders, and American tankers kept surviving. There was an interesting side effect. Some German gunners, frustrated with their rangefinders, started ignoring them and estimating distances manually. These gunners actually became more effective against modified tanks because they were using human pattern recognition instead of optical mathematics. This created a strange situation where less sophisticated German crews sometimes performed better than elite crews with the best equipment. Hard statistics from World War II are notoriously difficult to verify, but the available data tells a compelling story. In July 1944, American tank battalions in Normandy reported an average loss rate of 5.2 tanks per battalion per week from enemy anti-tank fire. By September 1944, after widespread adoption of these modifications, that number had dropped to 2.1 tanks per battalion per week. Not all of this reduction can be attributed to the modifications. American tactics improved, air support became more effective, and German defensive positions became less organized as the Allies broke out of Normandy. But crew survival rates tell a more specific story. Tank crews in modified Shermans reported a 64% higher survival rate in the first 30 seconds of enemy contact compared to unmodified tanks. That first 30 seconds, when a German gun would typically achieve a first-shot kill, was when the modifications made the biggest difference. One battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Anderson, kept detailed records. His battalion had 42 Sherman tanks. 26 adopted the modifications in early August. By the end of September, 19 of those 26 modified tanks were still in service with their original crews. Of the 16 unmodified tanks, only 4 remained operational. And none had their original crews. The modifications weren't perfect. They didn't stop shells that did hit. They didn't work at close range, where German gunners didn't need rangefinders. And they were time-consuming to maintain. Crews had to reapply mud and vegetation regularly as it fell off or dried out. But for $5 worth of materials and a few hours of work, crews could significantly increase their chances of surviving the war. In a conflict where Sherman crews had a lower life expectancy than infantry, that was everything. The story of the $5 modification never made it into official U.S. Army training manuals during World War II. It remained an informal field expedient, spread by word of mouth and practical example. After the war, a few military analysts studied the phenomenon. A 1947 report by the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps acknowledged that field modifications to disrupt optical rangefinding equipment showed significant practical value. But by then, military technology was moving toward radar-based ranging systems, and the lessons seemed obsolete. But the principle behind what those Sherman crews discovered remains relevant. Advanced technology has predictable behaviors and therefore exploitable weaknesses. Sometimes the most sophisticated systems can be defeated by understanding exactly how they work and introducing chaos into their calculations. Lieutenant Parker survived the war. He returned to teaching math in Ohio and rarely talked about his military service. Robert Chen became an architect in San Francisco and designed several notable buildings in the 1950s. Eddie Kowalski opened a garage in Detroit. None of them considered what they'd done particularly remarkable. They'd had a problem, thought about it carefully, and found a solution. The fact that their solution involved mud and tree branches instead of advanced engineering was, to them, beside the point. The last word belongs to Sergeant Kovacs, the man who'd watched his friends burn in July 1944. In a letter home written in November of that year, he described his now heavily modified tank. "She looks like hell, like something that crawled out of a swamp and decided to pretend to be a tank. But she's gotten me through 4 months of combat without a scratch. I'll take ugly and alive over pretty and dead any day of the week. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't official. It cost $5. And it worked."